Okay, thank you, Patricia. A lot of food for thought there. Our last speaker for this panel is Mark Fitzpatrick, who we're so happy to have back here at an arms control conference. He's been a speaker in the past. He's the director of the Nonproliferation and Disarmament Program at the IISS in London. His program focuses on challenges to the global nonproliferation regimes and on nuclear security, arms control, and disarmament issues. He's the author of many important publications in arms control and nonproliferation, including Overcoming Pakistan's Nuclear Dangers and the Iranian Nuclear Crisis, Avoiding Worst-Case Outcomes. He's also the editor of the IISS Strategic Dossiers on Countries and Regions of Proliferation Concern. He joined IISS in October 2005 after a 26-year career in the U.S. Department of State, including as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nonproliferation. Mark, please.
Thanks very much, Emily. So the key point about that introduction is that I'm a former State Department official, now working in London near Whitehall. And the caveat is that I didn't have to clear my remarks with either government. Apologies that unlike Yair, who seemed to have his presentation all in his head, and Patricia, who had everything on just one piece of paper, I'm not as good on my feet, so I had to write it all down. But as a break, you don't have to watch me reading all 10 pages. I've got a very short PowerPoint presentation. Thanks very much, Emily, for inviting me. Thank you, INSS. For giving me another opportunity to come back to Israel, something I'd like to do every year. Somebody who writes about Iran as much as I do really needs to come here regularly to stay grounded. And the only catch to this invitation was that I had to speak to the subject that I was assigned. And that subject was deterring rogue states. It didn't come with a question mark, unlike Patricia's subject, but if it did, my answer would be yes. Deterrence can work. In the nuclear realm, deterrence has worked for many years against very powerful opponents. The Soviet Union was deterred throughout the Cold War, as was China. And Alexei Abartov here would say, so was the United States. There's no reason to think it couldn't work against less powerful adversaries. Islamic Iran is no less rational than was communist Moscow or Maoist China. And the case of China is instructive. You know, back in the early 1960s, when China was crossing the nuclear threshold, there was this belief that the regime was heedless of human life, would be willing to lose tens of millions of its citizens, and therefore couldn't be deterred from using nuclear weapons. Now, the consequences of China's nuclearization were very adverse, including the transfer of nuclear weapons designs to Pakistan, which then passed them to Libya and probably to Iran. And yet, a nuclear-armed China proved itself to be a rational actor that could, in fact, be deterred from using the nuclear arsenal. Now, some say, now, Iran's different. Iran is different because it would actually welcome a calamitous war, because global chaos would bring about the conditions for the return of the Mahdi, the savior-like figure central to Shia theology. But the historical record suggests that when its national security is at stake, Iran behaves in a broadly rational manner. When Iraq launched missile attacks on Iranian cities in 1988 during the Iran-Iraq War, Ayatollah Khamenei, who had previously declared that he wouldn't accept a ceasefire agreement under any condition other than total Iraqi surrender, in fact, drank from the poisoned chalice and agreed to a ceasefire, recognizing the new situation. More recently, I would say that Iran was deterred from allowing Hezbollah to use long-distance rockets against Tel Aviv in the Lebanon war in the summer of 2006, but you all know much more about that than I do. In assessing the issue of deterring rogue states, 3 questions should be addressed. And here's the first of my very complex slides. Who, when, and how? Who is to be deterred? What is to be deterred? And how is deterrence applied? Let me start with question 1. My assigned title was Rogue States. Now, I might have chosen a more politically correct term, though I don't know one that immediately conveys the meaning that we all instinctively assign to rogue states. I mean, one could say recalcitrant countries, pariahs, outlaws, treaty transgressors, proliferators, or simply states of concern, the term that Madeleine Albright used at the end of the Clinton administration to replace rogue state designations. Rogue is probably accurate in the sense of defying international norms. It may also be accurate in terms of countries that challenge the world order and that develop nuclear, that bad, huh? Or chemical weapons. No, let me start over. May be accurate in characterizing countries that challenge the international norm and develop nuclear weapon or chemical weapon capabilities in violation of treaty obligations. 3 states today arguably fit this definition: North Korea, Iran, and Syria. I say arguably because Iran's status in terms of being in current violation of the NPT is open to debate. And Syria probably is no longer developing nuclear and chemical weapons, but it hasn't yet given up all of its chemical weapons arsenal, and there are doubts about the completeness of its chemical weapons declaration. Other states that arguably fit the rogue state definition category include Libya, Iraq, and possibly Burma. And I would say that recently fit the category. Now, there's also pariah states like Zimbabwe, Sudan, Cuba. Sometimes they're also called rogue, but the thing is they're not really suspected today of developing nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. So they're outside the context of our discussion on deterrence. Question 2, what is to be deterred? In the Cold War usage, deterrence usually meant deterring nuclear use and, secondarily, acts of aggression. In the narrow sense, deterrence worked perfectly. Since 1945, there hasn't been a single use of nuclear weapons, though deterrence is not solely responsible for that state of affairs. In the wider sense, deterring aggression worked imperfectly. Soviet and Chinese acts of aggression against U.S. treaty allies were deterred, but non-allies who didn't enjoy the same degree of protection often suffered. Patricia noted that United Kingdom possession of nuclear weapons certainly didn't deter Argentina from attacking the Falklands, didn't deter the Vietnamese from keeping up a long war against the United States. In today's world, I think you could say that deterrence in the nuclear context can also mean deterring not just nuclear use, but nuclear production and even nuclear development. Let's look at the success rate of these deterrence goals for the various rogue states, keeping in mind that outcomes have various drivers, and I'm just going to limit this analysis to the nuclear field. So here's my last slide. This is a highly simplistic analysis. But in this analysis, you'll see that there are more cases of deterrence failing than of it working. The only clear cases of success are that North Korea... Here, do I have a pointer here? Right. Where's my pointer? Right. North Korea has been deterred so far from using nuclear weapons, and Iran has been deterred so far from actually producing them. None of the other rogue states have used or produced them either, but none of them have had the capability. So for them, I assign the grade of non-applicable. There are no cases when the rogues have been deterred from nuclear development. With the exception of Burma, where the case is unclear, it's murky, really, the evidence for Burmese developing nuclear capabilities. All of these rogue states went down the path of nuclear development. But this is tautological, after all, because I've defined rogue states to mean states that went down that path. That's why my chart doesn't include Cuba. In this analysis, the evidence concerning nuclear weapons development is mixed for Iran and Libya, because each took action in 2003 to suspend nuclear weapons development, and in Gaddafi's case, to give up his production equipment. Since that was the year of the US-led invasion of Iraq, and since both Iran and Libya had reason to fear that they might be next, a case could be made that they were deterred from continuing their nuclear weapons development. In Iran's case, some development continued, but the structured work was suspended according to the US 2007 National Intelligence Estimate. There are other reasons why Libya gave up its weapons of mass destruction in 2003. When the BBC China was intercepted that year in October, carrying nuclear and uranium enrichment material, production material, equipment, Gaddafi realized that the black market had been infiltrated and that the gig was up. He also had incentives as well as disincentives to give up the WMD. Now, the record for Iran and Syria regarding deterring aggression, I would say, is also mixed. An analysis of their foreign adventurism goes beyond the scope of my talk, and many of you know more about it than I do. But I think it's fair to say that neither has been as aggressive beyond their borders as they might be were it not for the fear of retaliation. Question 3. How is deterrence to be applied? The focus of this panel is supposed to be nuclear deterrence, but deterrence as applied to rogue states is not necessarily nuclear. Only in the event that a rogue state used or threatened to use nuclear weapons would its adversaries consider using nuclear weapons in response. Now, admittedly, the U.S. Nuclear Policy Review document of 2010 allowed for use in some other cases. But as a practical matter, it's impossible for me to come up with a real-world situation where this would be remotely possible. Maybe you have better imaginations. I would argue that it's highly unlikely that any of the established nuclear weapons states would break the 69-year taboo and use nuclear weapons for preemptive purposes. Apart from the moral qualms against being the first to again use A-bombs, these weapons are unnecessary and counterproductive for purposes of deterrence against states with much smaller capabilities. They're unnecessary, I argue, because for almost any military objective for which one might envision nuclear weapons, the objective can be accomplished with conventional weapons. America's 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrators, for example, can reach the depths of the Fordo enrichment facility. Most importantly, deterrence via conventional weapons is much more credible, a point Patricia made. I would say it's counterproductive to make threats of nuclear retaliation that the adversary knows are not credible. Yair said this in a different way when he said that conventional capabilities play a greater role today in strategic stability. Allow me to conclude with a couple more thoughts about deterring Iran. I wrote a book in 2007 on the Iranian nuclear crisis, Avoiding Worst-Case Scenarios, in which I argue that containment and deterrence strategies are critical to keeping Iran from crossing the line from nuclear capabilities to nuclear production. I don't think we need to, I didn't dwell then, and I don't think we need to dwell too much about Iranian nuclear use, because it's a given. Any Iranian use of nuclear weapons would bring devastating regime-ending retaliation. And in any case, that's not the policy issue today. Obama's policy is not containment. He insists that Iran cannot be allowed to obtain nuclear weapons. The policy is to dissuade and deter Iran from crossing the red line to weaponization. So I would argue it's a new and more complex application of deterrence theory. Some critics of Obama's stance still insist that the issue should not be deterring Iran from producing nuclear weapons. Rather, they say it should be preventing Iran from having the capability to produce the weapons. Unfortunately, Iran has had that capability for several years. It has the equipment, the feedstock, and the know-how. One thing it doesn't have is sufficient time to produce nuclear weapons before the attempt would be discovered. The aim of the negotiations is to ensure that this time is extended sufficiently. What Iran also lacks to date is a political decision to produce the weapons. Western policy aims to keep it that way. Deterrence requires declaratory policies to let Iran know that the major powers would take whatever action is necessary to stop it from crossing the line to weapons acquisition. Obama has said this, I think, clearly enough many times, that all options are on the table. Some critics have argued that his credibility was undercut by America's decision not to employ military action when Assad crossed Obama's red line on chemical weapons use. I assume that Iranians know that when it comes to American national security interests, internal chemical weapons use by Assad does not compare with Iranian nuclear weapons acquisition. Harvard political scientist Stephen Walt put it well in a commentary last month. America does not have to fight wars in places that don't matter in order to convince allies and adversaries that it will fight in places that do matter. And in fact, wasting resources on pointless wars can undermine credibility. The Iraq intervention left the United States weaker and its people war-weary. Walt added that staying out of a quagmire like Syria and declining to intervene in Crimea tells the world nothing about the U.S. commitment to defend genuine interests. Indeed, Washington's other commitments will be easier to meet if it isn't distracted by peripheral conflicts of little strategic importance. It's clear to me that preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons is a critical national security priority for the United States. I have no doubt that Obama would employ military force to stop Iran from producing nuclear weapons, and I have no doubt that the American public would support such action. The tricky part regards the credibility of the evidence that Iran was crossing the line from capability to production. In practice, breakout is not likely to be clearly visible, well-defined acts with immediate consequences. Iran's modus operandi is likely to involve the accumulation of small transgressions, each of which individually would not necessarily sound the warning bell. Iran could use various ruses, for example, to delay the arrival of inspectors, to buy time in order to be able to present the world with a fait accompli before Security Council members had time to act. So deterring Iran from crossing the line to nuclear breakout will be more viable to the extent that the line is made more visible. The conditions for any deal, therefore, have to include measures that would provide an easily detectable tripwire that would signal breakout. As well as a credible threat if red lines are crossed, a successful deterrence strategy must include a corresponding reassurance to Iran's leaders that their country's sovereignty and security will not be threatened if the red lines are not crossed. Deterrence thus includes both disincentives and incentives. The overall objective of this strategy is to influence Iran's strategic decision-making by reinforcing its reasons for stopping well short of building nuclear weapons. I'm optimistic that these two red boxes are going to remain that color for the foreseeable future. And I thank you.